The American Independent. Ted Cruz and Rick Scott back House GOP efforts to shut down the government. The two Republican senators oppose even considering legislation to help avert an October 1 shutdown. Sen. Ted Cruz, Republican Texas, is seen in the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday, September 6, 2023. Tom Williams/CQ roll call via AP Images. Sen. Ted Cruz, Republican Texas, is seen in the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday, September 6, 2023. Tom Williams/CQ roll call via AP Images. Much of the federal government could shut down on October 1, with far-right members of the House Republican majority unable to come to an agreement on federal funding for the upcoming fiscal year. Since Ted Cruz, Republican Texas, and Rick Scott, Republican Florida, have been cheering those extremists on. The House has approved just one of the 12 must-pass appropriations bills needed to keep the government operational each year. Although President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican California, reached an agreement in May, members of the arch-conservative House Freedom Caucus have refused to allow votes on legislation to fund the government at those levels or on a short-term extension of last year's spending levels. After narrowly winning their 2018 re-election races, Cruz and Scott are the most vulnerable Republican Senate incumbents on the ballot in 2024, according to the Cook Political Report. Both sided with the far-right House GOP faction against a bipartisan spending deal. Thank God for the Freedom Caucus and all they are doing to ensure Washington does its job and reins in Democrats' reckless spending. Scott tweeted on September 12, since 2019, the population is up 8%, but budgets have grown by 55%. It makes no sense. Drives inflation must be stopped. During an appearance at a Freedom Caucus press conference on the same day, he said, "I thank God for what the Freedom Caucus is doing in the House. If they don't stand up, nobody's standing up. They stood up on the debt ceiling, and they fought for a great bill. Unfortunately, it didn't end up that way, but they fought for a great bill. We've got to stop this insanity." Cruz praised Texas Republican Rep. Chip Roy, the Freedom Caucus policy chair and Cruz's own former chief of staff, for fighting against the compromise. He told Spectrum News on Monday, "What Chip is arguing for is that Republicans, who were just given a majority in the House, ought to stand up and fight for the priorities that the people elected them to fight for. I think that's exactly right. Washington often presents a false choice that either you have to completely concede to the massive spending, the unprecedented debt that is fueling inflation that is hurting Texans across the state. You either have to completely roll over to the Democrats, or the alternative is a shutdown." Cruz said, according to Spectrum News, "I don't think we should have a shutdown. While a shutdown would not stop the federal government from carrying out some essential functions, it would have to cease most operations, and federal workers would not get paid. This would mean older Americans would be unable to file new Social Security claims, that lower-income citizens would be unable to access food aid through the Women, Infants and Children Nutrition Program, veterans would not be able to get services, and food safety inspections would grind to a halt. Recent shutdowns have reduced the nation's gross domestic product by billions of dollars." While the House Republicans have been unable to agree on a path forward, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate have joined together to offer bipartisan appropriations bills. On September 14, the Senate voted 91-7 to begin debate on a three-bill minibus package to fund the Departments of Agriculture, Veterans Affairs, Transportation, and Housing and Urban Development, as well as the Food and Drug Administration and Military Construction. For the next fiscal year, Cruz and Scott both voted against the proposal.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I'm on the floor again with my colleague from Texas, Senator Cruz, trying once again to pass our Pay Our Military Act. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining what we're trying to do here. Since 48 hours ago, we tried to do the same thing. We're in our conference right now trying to get to a compromise, working through things to make sure we don't have a government shutdown. It may or may not happen. It's looking more likely, though. And as we get closer to that moment, the idea that we would leave the men and women who protect this country uncertain about whether they're going to get paid, even though they're still going to deploy, they're going to still be fighting all over the world, protecting this nation. So we're going to leave them out hanging, right? So all we're trying to do, Mr. President, is the most common sense thing you could do if you cared one bit about the troops of the United States, And that's say, hey, we know you're worried. We know you're probably deployed. We know your wife or spouse is back home, worried about where you're going to get paid next week. You got a dangerous mission you're going on tonight somewhere in the world. So we're going to take that worry away from you because we care about you. Now, granted, my colleagues might say, well, what about the IRS worker? What about the Department of Interior worker? No offense, there's a little bit of a difference, okay? There's a little bit of a difference. We all know it. We should know it. So as we get closer, this is the bipartisan solution that we all need to undertake. And, Mr. President, here's the thing. As I said last week, when we had the identical situation in 2013, 10 years ago, identical, a Democrat-controlled Senate, a Republican-controlled House, a Democrat-controlled White House. It was looking like there was going to be a shutdown. What did everybody unanimously agree to? Hey, let's take the troops out of this. Let's make sure the men and women who serve in our military are not worried. Let's unanimously pass the Pay Our Military Act. So 10 years ago, we did that. Now, I wasn't here, but I applaud everybody who did that. Simple. Identical. Identical. So what's changed? I have no idea what's changed. And it looks like my Democratic colleagues are going to come down and object and make some gobbledygook argument about appropriations or let's keep trying. The government's going to shut down tomorrow evening. We're going to keep trying. But let's take one group of Americans and say, hey, we know you sacrifice more than anybody. We're going to take that worry away from you. We did it 10 years ago in a bipartisan way, so we're going to do it again. So, Mr. President, you know, I guarantee you agree with this bill. As a veteran of almost 30 years, naval aviator, you know what it's like. There's guys on aircraft carriers right now, women on aircraft carriers flying F-18s, and their spouses back home are going, "Hey, honey, guess what? I don't think I'm going to have money to buy groceries next week." And that guy's getting ready to take off on some carrier in the Indo-PACOM region, and he's got to worry about that. He's got to worry about that. She's got to worry about that. We can fix that right now. Right now. And we've done it before, and I can't imagine my Democratic colleagues are going to come up and object to this bill. I'm starting to get mad. We don't want a government shutdown, but we can protect certain people, for goodness sakes. And if we're not going to protect our troops and their families, I don't know who we should protect. So maybe my colleagues are on the floor getting ready to say, you know what, geez, Senator Sullivan, Senator Cruz, we relent. These are good ideas. And you know why we know these are good ideas? Because we all did this 10 years ago. I have no idea why we didn't do it now. So Mr. President, I yield the floor and recognize my colleague from Texas.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, unless something significant changes 35 hours from now, the federal government will shut down. At 12:01 a.m. on Sunday, the paychecks will stop for every soldier, every sailor, every airman, every Marine, every member of the Space Force, and every Coast Guardsman. That's not right. And the good news is we can prevent it. We can prevent it right now. The bill that Senator Sullivan and I are trying to pass says at 12:01 a.m., our active duty military will be paid. That if Washington's dysfunctional, if politicians will bicker throughout the night, that's not their fault. And we're not going to hold them hostage to the partisan demands of politicians. You know, right now at home, there are people watching this debate on C-SPAN. And they may be wondering, when did the Senate get this dysfunctional? Did this institution ever operate? And you know, Senator Sullivan pointed out to a time where it at least operated a little better than it does now. 2013, this identical legislation was before the Senate. There was a Democrat majority. Harry Reid was the majority leader. And this identical legislation passed 100 to nothing. And it passed unanimously in the House. In 2013, Senate Democrats realized, fine, we'll have a fight, but we're not holding our active duty military hostage. Mr. President, in 2013, Senator Durbin, who is sitting on the floor, voted yes to fund our military. In 2013, Senator Whitehouse, who's sitting on the floor, voted yes to fund our military. In 2013, Senator Murray, who I believe is getting ready to stand up and block this bill, in 2013, she voted yes to fund our military. Have we really gone that far in a decade that Democrats now are perfectly happy to take away the paychecks from the young men and women who are risking their lives to keep us safe? Mr. President, you spent years in the active duty military. You're a proud Navy veteran. You know men and women that are serving right now in the active duty, and I feel quite confident you don't want to go home and look them in the eyes and say it was my party, the Democrat Party, that took your paycheck away. Well, it doesn't have to happen. Everyone at home, I want you to listen to what's going to happen in a moment, because there are two magic words. If you hear two magic words from the senator from Washington, I object. If you hear those words, understand what will have happened. It's the same thing that happened just a couple of days ago, which is Democrat leadership said to our active duty military, we don't give a damn about you and we're going to cut off your paycheck Sunday at 12:01 a.m. That doesn't have to happen. And by the way, I will point out, not only is it the fault of every Democrat, and I'm sorry, Mr. President, it's the fault of every Democrat because there are no Democrats here supporting us. You in your heart know we're right. So I'm going to invite you when we do this again, because we're going to keep doing it and keep doing it, I would invite you to come join us because you know this is the right thing to do. And there are more of your colleagues on the Democrat side that know this is the right thing to do. Some 19-year-old Marine right now in the DMZ facing North Korean machine guns is being told that the United States Senate doesn't care enough about his or her service to pay them. That's just wrong. It's stupid. And this body used to know enough to say, hey, we got political disagreements here, but we support our troops. I guarantee you every Democrat senator in this chamber goes home and tells your constituents, I support the troops. You know what? Talk's cheap. If you support the troops, stand up next to us and say, let's pay the troops. And by the way, if you support the troops, go to your leadership and say, stop this garbage. Was Harry Reid a right-wing kook? Because Harry Reid signed off on paying the troops. And I'll tell you why today's Democrat leadership believe they can get away with it. Because in 2013, we had something of a functioning media. They actually reported on what was happening. If you look up in the gallery, there are a total of 0 reporters there. There's not one. The corrupt corporate media doesn't intend to tell the citizens of Washington State or the citizens of Illinois or the citizens of Rhode Island or the citizens of Arizona. They don't intend to tell them your Democrat senator is why active duty military isn't being paid. And so every reporter, yesterday I had reporters running after me going, oh, isn't this Republican shutdown terrible? And I said, those are great talking points. Have you written a single story about the fact that the reason our military is not going to be paid is because Democrat leadership is objecting? No, because none of them have written that story. Every one of you know what the right thing to do is. And so my hope is there's a tiny, still voice inside of some Democrat senators that will stand up and go to your leadership and say, we can fight all day long on partisan issues, but we're not going to take our troops hostage. That's the right thing to do. And every member of this body knows it. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Appropriations Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 2835 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. As I have said, I share my colleagues' concern with making sure that our service members do not miss a paycheck because of a potential government shutdown. In fact, I do not want any of our federal workers to miss a paycheck, whether they are cancer researchers whose work saves our lives or brave firefighters who risk their lives for us. And I don't want any programs families rely on to be undermined. Counseling and transition assistance for new veterans adjusting to civilian life. Nutrition assistance for 7 million moms and kids who need a hand up, and that includes our service members' families. You know, several years ago, I worked to save a WIC clinic, which was going to be kicked off a Navy base in my home state of Washington that hundreds of military families counted on. None of those paychecks for any of these workers and none of those programs should shutter because of a completely unnecessary shutdown, which is why I am working around the clock with the majority of our colleagues to make sure that we do pass a bipartisan CR, which we released this week, because that is the only serious solution here. That is the only way that we will make sure everyone is able to keep doing the work that the American people count on and getting that paycheck that they do deserve. So if the senator from Alaska or the senator from Texas are serious about making sure our service members get paid, I hope they'll get serious in a way that matters the most, and that's their votes. I hope they will work with us to keep the government open, and I hope they will reconsider their recent votes against the CR to fund the government in a bipartisan and timely way. Let's be real. You cannot grandstand about wanting to make sure that service members get paid during a shutdown and then vote against the very bipartisan bill that prevented a shutdown. I also hope the senators will understand that our service members will see the harm of a government shutdown in so many other ways. Permanent change in station moves will be significantly curtailed, meaning that some of our families could be left without a place to live if they've already sold their house or broken their lease, or they could be forced to pay for 2 homes at once. For the Army alone, this means approximately 2,100 moves every week. And if you do not work with us to keep the entire government open, service members' elective surgeries and procedures at DoD medical and dental facilities would have to be postponed. And by the way, an elective surgery could be anything from removing a kidney stone to a mastectomy for breast cancer. Essentially, post and base services will be closed or severely limited. That is everything from our commissary statewide to childcare our military families count on. So not only do I want to make sure that our service members don't miss a paycheck, I want to make sure that our service members don't miss out on any critical services they rely on every day. The senators should also understand that their focus and support of the military cannot end with those who are currently in uniform. And they should remember, 47% of Department of Defense civilians are veterans. And for that matter, 1 in every 4 employees across the entire federal government are veterans. We can't leave anyone behind. So I'll say it again for my colleagues who raise their voices here on the Senate floor, but have not cast their votes to prevent a shutdown. There are a lot of programs I care about, a lot of programs we all care about that would be hurt by a shutdown. But we are not going to solve this problem one by one, carve out by carve out. The best solution is to stop a shutdown in the first place. That is something we can do, and I bet we could do it a lot more quickly if the senators from Alaska and Texas would earnestly work with us. This isn't complicated. We've got a straightforward, bipartisan CR package that will avoid that shutdown, keep our military paid. So let's get our jobs done and get that passed. Thank you, Mr. President. I object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard.
So my colleague,
Senator from Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'm going to try and keep this short because the issues that we're debating here are not that complicated. I agree with my colleague from Washington State. We are working around the clock. We're in our conference right now trying to get an amendment to bolster border security that the whole country, by the way, wants. Democrats, Republicans, the whole country wants that. So we're working around the clock too, and my colleague did misstate something. I actually voted to get on this bill. And I voted to get on this bill. So her statement about my vote, she needs to check my vote the other day. But be that as it may, once again, she says there's only one serious solution. Well, Mr. President, this body's done this before. The senator from Washington State has done this before. On the eve of a shutdown in 2013, the senator from Washington State voted for this bill. Every senator voted for this bill. So when she keeps saying, let's get real, I agree, let's get real. Go look at your vote from 2013. You voted for this on the eve of a shutdown. I'll remind my colleague from Washington State in 2019 when there was a partial government shutdown, focused on the Coast Guard, which wasn't getting paid, and the Democrats blocked my bill to pay the Coast Guard. She actually stated, quote, it's absolutely unacceptable that our Coast Guard families went without their paychecks during the shutdown. We need to make sure President Trump doesn't put them through this again. Well, I'm going to put the senator from Washington State's words back at her. It is absolutely unacceptable that Coast Guard and other family members went without paychecks during the shutdown. We need to make sure it doesn't happen again, so vote for our bill. Every time they object, the arguments of why they're objecting to something they already agreed to 10 years ago get more tangled up. We're all working to avoid a shutdown, but if it doesn't happen, let's make sure the men and women who are risking their lives for our country and their families know that they're going to get paid. That's all we're asking. That's all we're asking. And everybody in this body 10 years ago did this, including the senator from Washington State. And it's just beyond comprehension that they're coming up with arguments now to not do this. This isn't about politics. This is about supporting our troops at the moment they really need it. And they're not doing that. I yield the floor to my colleague from Texas.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, at the opening of her remarks, the senator from Washington said, I agree with the objective of this bill. I agree with what Senator Sullivan and Senator Cruz are trying to accomplish. Then she talked for a while, and then she blocked the entirety of the bill. Everything in between saying, I agree with this bill, and the two magic words at the end of her remarks, I object, I have to admit, brought me back to Saturday morning cartoons and watching Peanuts and the teacher going, wah, 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 because they were words, but they didn't mean anything. This is a binary choice. At 12:01 a.m. on Sunday, are soldiers going to get paid, yes or no? Are sailors going to get paid, yes or no? Are airmen going to get paid, yes or no? Are Marines going to get paid, yes or no? Are members of the Space Force going to get paid, yes or no? Are Coast Guardsmen going to get paid, yes or no? A decade ago, every member of this body voted to pay them. Since this debate began, the presiding officer had been Senator Kelly, has now been replaced by Senator Murphy from Connecticut. I would point out, Senator Murphy voted yes to pay our active duty military in 2013. And yet now the Democrats are blocking those paychecks. Senator from Washington said, well, gosh, the Democrats have a CR that you could have voted for. Senator from Washington knows fully well that the bill drafted by Democrat leadership is not going to pass the House of Representatives. She knows that. The result's going to be a shutdown. And what's changed from 2013 to now? From 2013 to now, the Democrat leadership is perfectly willing to hold a young man or woman in the military, to hold their paychecks hostage. Well, something interesting is going to happen at 12:01 a.m., 35 hours from now. Paychecks of every federal employee will stop. The paychecks of the stenographer who's recording my words will stop. The paychecks of the clerks sitting down front will stop. But you know what, Mr. President? There are 535 people whose paychecks will not stop. Under the Constitution, members of this body, senators, and members of the House, their paychecks can't stop even during a shutdown. Which means at 12:01 a.m. on Sunday, every Democrat senator will keep drawing their paycheck, while the people risking their lives to defend us will not. Well, I'll tell you, Mr. President, I have in writing instructed the Senate that I will not accept a paycheck so long as our active duty military is not being paid. It is wrong. Senators are paid $174,000 a year by law. The Democrat leadership who stands up and says, "I object," is telling a 19-year-old woman in a nuclear sub right now defending our nation that her paycheck doesn't matter anymore. There's right now a mom in tennis shoes serving in the military who's discovering that her mortgage payment, she doesn't know how to pay. And so I'm going to suggest to the reporters who aren't here and aren't covering this that so long as Democrat leadership keeps blocking what has been bipartisan and unanimous legislation previously, that every Democrat senator ought to be asked, are you taking a paycheck come 12:01 a.m. on Sunday? They're the ones objecting, they're the ones stopping, and every soldier needs to understand, why are you not being paid? Because the Democrats objected. Every sailor needs to understand, because the Democrats objected. Every airman, every Marine, every Coast Guardsman, every member of the Space Force. When your paycheck goes away 35 hours from now, it is because of two magic words the Democrat leadership has said. And let's be clear, it's not just the senator from Washington. She's doing it on an instruction from the Democrat leadership. They could change it like that. And I can tell you this, Senator Sullivan and I are going to keep coming back over and over and over again, because there's not a member of this body that wants to go home to your state. Even a state like Connecticut. You don't want to be at home looking at active duty military and saying, yep, my party took away your paycheck. That's too cynical even for this body.